A committee had been formed. The chief Qadi, the mosque's imam, religious scholars and the doyens of draftsmen and masons would get together to inspect the damage and report their findings. After that, provided the Sultan agreed to it, Sinan would repair the Hagia Sophia. For this I need to go back to Istanbul, and I'd like you to accompany me. Jahan bowed his head, glowing with excitement. What an honor it would be to renovate this pearl of architecture, once a beloved basilica, now a grand mosque. The building that had goaded Justinian to exclaim with pride, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." Yet, at the same time, Jahan had the distinct sensation that there was more to it than they had been told. He said, "Should our Sultan give permission for the mosque to be restored, what will happen to the surrounding houses?" A shadow crossed Sinan's face. "They will be demolished." Jahan took a breath, understanding Sinan's conundrum. His master had to make a choice between the people and the building, and he had clearly chosen the latter. Back in Istanbul, on the day of the meeting, much to their astonishment, they were joined by the sovereign and his entourage. Eager to see the situation with his own eyes, Sultan Selim had decided to come, attended by his grandees and viziers. Thus they walked around the Hagia Sophia. What they beheld was distressing beyond words. Gutters ran alongside the mosque's outer walls, leaking a murky water that left those who came into contact with it dirtier than before. On its edges frogs croaked, rats scampered, and faces piled up, of animals and humans alike. Around a bend they saw the carcass of a dog, its jaw missing, its eyes open wide as though still in horror. All the people living around the mosque had recently moved to Istanbul. Leaving their villages behind, they had migrated to the seat of the throne without a shelter awaiting them, kinsfolk to trust or land to till. Having heard from others that the area around the Hagia Sophia was unoccupied and within easy reach, they had put down roots there. It wasn't only sheds of all sizes that encroached on the ancient building. There were ateliers, stables, sheep pens, milking parlors, chicken coops, latrines. Together, they leaned against the mosque, pushing into it from four sides. Such had been the pressure that the western walls of the Hagia Sophia, where the settlement was the most dense, had begun to tilt inwards. The entourage entered a cobbler's workshop. The artisan, wild-eyed with fear and dumbfounded at the sight of the Sultan, trembled and stuttered, unable to answer a single question. Mercifully, he did not faint. Down the street, in a lean-to, they saw huge cauldrons in which the intestines of animals were boiled to make candles. So horrible was the stench that the Sultan, holding a silk handkerchief to his nose, bolted out. The rest followed in haste. One of the residents of this motley neighborhood had built a cattle shed and a 3-story house, renting the spare rooms to students and pilgrims. Another, in an attempt to open up a well in his back garden, had excavated deep into the ground, damaging the foundations of the Hagia Sophia. A third had raised a house that collapsed, miraculously without hurting anyone. After this he put up a second, this time succeeding in keeping it upright. Now a pile of rubble lay in his garden, where children played and dogs roamed. When the tour was over, the Sultan called from atop his stallion, "Chief Royal Architect, step forward." Sinan did so, bowing low. "This is outrageous. It's my wish to have the mosque restored." Sinan bowed again, closing his eyes in gratitude. "I give you my blessing. Start the restoration without delay. Set up buttresses where needed. Demolish the sheds. None of them were built with my permission." The Sultan waved a ring-bedecked hand, at which two servants came forward. One leading the way, the other carrying a kaftan of pure silk trimmed with ermine. The Grand Vizier took this and turned to Sinan, who was still kneeling, and asked him, in a gentle voice, to stand up. In this way, the architect was presented with the robe of honor. Davad, Yusuf, Nicola, and Jahan cast furtive glances at one another, unable to suppress their smiles. "Well, then. You may begin the work," the Sultan declared, pulling the reins of his horse, ready to leave. "Your Majesty, one of the unlawful buildings is a storehouse that belongs to the palace," said Sinan. "Are we permitted to knock it down along with everything else?" Sultan Selim hesitated, though briefly. "Do what you need to do." The next day, they inspected the neighborhoods of Zarek and Kalenderhain. Here, too, they found unlicensed constructions aplenty. Sinan decided to carve a space 35 cubits wide around the holy mosque and level everything within that area. He made his apprentices write down the plan for the work in detail. Not once, but twice. One copy for the approval of the Sultan, one for the archives of the architects in Vifa. They put on record their pledge to fix up the parts of the Hagia Sophia, inside and outside, that had fallen into disrepair, bring fresh water to the mosque by means of new canals, cover the leaking roofs with lead, replace the wooden base of the minaret, dilapidated and crumbling, with a strong, brick one, open up a 3-cubit wide strip around the madrasa by dismantling the sheds, leave a clear space 35 cubits wide both left and right of the Hagia Sophia and knock down every unlawful structure, use the stones, bricks, and planks obtained from the demolitions in the repair of the Hagia Sophia. Shortly after he had received the list, the Sultan not only sent his approval but also issued a decree to the chief Qadi of the city of Istanbul and the head of the endowment of the Hagia Sophia Mosque. "This is my order to you and it ought to be followed at once and in its entirety." When it was reported to me that the great mosque suffered from the wear of time and the tear of people, and begged to be mended, I personally inspected the area in the company of the Master of Royal Architects and other experts, may God increase their wisdom, and have come to the conclusion that the restoration is essential and, as such, ought to be executed, since the repair of revered sanctuaries is the behest of God the Almighty and a noble responsibility for the Sultan. Therefore, I command you to help the chief royal architect and his draftsmen, and to make sure that whatever they need is provided so that they can excel in their task. Buoyed by the decree, Sinan and the apprentices embarked on the work. With them were 85 laborers equipped with mallets and sledgehammers, as well as a great quantity of gunpowder. Animals, too, oxen, camels, mules and chota. When they reached the Hagia Sophia, they found a throng of people waiting. They stood in the way, a wall of flesh and bone, not letting the laborers pass. Dark, hollow eyes squinted with exasperation, mouths drawn tight. The anger in the air was palpable. Unused to hatred of this kind, the apprentices were taken aback. So was their master, his face drained of blood, and suddenly looking very old. "What's going on?" asked Sinan. "We are destroying their homes," said Nicola. "Master, allow me to talk to them." It was Davad who said this. "They come from where I come. I know my people. We don't want to turn them into enemies." "He's right," Jahan said. "We ought to persuade them before we start." Pulling his cloak around him, as though exposed to a draught, Sinan conceded. "Davad, go, speak with them. Make sure you tell them we shall compensate them for their losses." Our Sultan gave his word. Then he turned to The laborers. We shan't do anything today. The next morning when they arrived the street was empty and things seemed calm. That is until the foreman came running, his face flushed crimson, and said, without offering so much as a greeting, Effendi, pray. What is it? Sinan asked. They have stolen our tools, broken our carts. They are not letting us work. Wicked people. A crowd, larger and angrier than the one from the day before, had gathered on the other side of the mosque, he explained. What do they want? They say this is an infidel's temple, explained Snowy Gabriel. The nerve of them. They spread mean rumors about you, forgive me for saying so, master. What do they say? Asked Sinan. Snowy Gabriel lowered his gaze. They say since you are a Christian convert, you want to destroy the homes of good Muslims for the sake of a church. Sinan said, his brow puckered in concern. Mosques, churches, synagogues are built to honor God. How can they be disrespected? The mob heard none of this. In the ensuing days, the apprentices dealt with one trouble after another. The laborers were intimidated. 2 animals were found dead, poisoned. Fearing something might happen to Chota, Jahan stopped bringing him to the site. Not a nail could be hammered, not a stone removed. A week later Sinan sent his apprentices to the chief Cuddy to get help. He was a grey-bearded man with sunken eyes and a cautious mien. Jahan had expected him to be angry at the squatters. Instead, he was furious at Sinan. Your master wrote to the Sultan, and our Sultan, benevolent as he is, took his plea seriously. Look where it has brought us now. Effendi, aren't these people to blame? Jahan asked. They have unlawfully built around the Hagia Sophia and... Right, the chief Cuddy cut him off. I'll see what I can do. Don't expect miracles. The apprentices left the Cuddy's place demoralized. Jahan understood that the people who could help them would refrain from doing so, out of bitterness or laziness or jealousy of Sinan's success. Things might never have improved had it not been for the fatwa that was issued soon after. The Grand Mufti's words rained on the city like hailstones, quenching all fires, small and large. Question: there are those who say, on the subject of the repair of a holy mosque that was formerly a church, we are not leaving because an infidel's building is bound to collapse, and it is not important if it collapses, and there are those who support them, saying that anyone who renovates an infidel's temple is an infidel. What shall be done about such people and those who follow them? Answer: anyone who says such erroneous things is an infidel himself and shall be executed. Those who prevent the work will be punished. The restoration of the mosque shall proceed steadily, as befits the righteous Sharia. From then on, things simmered down. There were no more mobs on the streets, though minor incidents occurred here and there, pilfering of equipment. Mostly. Sinan returned to Adrianople with Yusuf to complete the Salimiye mosque. Jahan didn't like this. He would rather keep an eye on Yusuf. He still had not been able to question him about his secret meetings with Tommaso, and seeing him alone with the master made him uneasy. Davud, Nicola, and Jahan were left in charge of the work around the Hagia Sophia. Every few days they were to send their master a letter to keep him apprised of what they had accomplished. Gradually the letters dwindled away, a guilty silence filling the distance between the master and the apprentices. This they never confessed to Sinan, but the apprentices who stayed in Istanbul were ill at ease. Every day they tried to forewarn the inhabitants of the hovels. They were going to demolish, tried to give them enough time to remove their belongings. But the people were either too slow or reluctant, so time and again The same sorrowful scene erupted, entire families, amid tears and curses, dragging away what little they had, kitchen utensils, lamps, mats, toys, a cradle, a kilim, a bird in its cage. Jahan began to wander around the quarter to clear his head, sometimes with another apprentice, more often alone. One such day, he and Nicola were passing through a grimy alley cramped with half-emptied ateliers when they saw two children coming towards them. A girl and a boy, sister and brother, given the resemblance, with sage-green eyes glittering over dark freckles, which gave them a look of mischief. They had close-cut hair, a precaution against lice. Both were barefoot. Bending his knees, Jahan said, "Hey, little ones. You should not be here on your own. Where do you live?" The girl pointed to a shed at the end of the alley. Nicola and Jahan exchanged a guilty glance. It was one of the places they would raise the next morning. The boy grabbed his hand and began to pull with all his might. From under his large, frayed shirt sleeves, his wrists showed two white sticks. Jahan understood with terror that the child wanted them to follow him to his house. He said, louder than he intended, "No, I can't come with you." The children were adamant, while the boy beseeched with his large, liquid eyes. The girl tugged at Nicola. In the end the apprentices could not resist them. A fusty odor of mildew and decay hit Jahan and Nicola as they stepped into the hovel the children called home. Inside the first room, a sick man lay on the floor. He was attended by a woman covered from head to toe. When she saw them she left the room in a hurry. "My father," said the girl. At the sound of her voice, the patient, who until then had been listless, turned his head. The stare he gave Jahan was one of pain. When he opened his mouth, only a sibilant whisper came out. The girl, unshaken, leaned towards him, listened, nodded, and said, "He asks if your name is Israel." Jahan shuddered. The man was clearly having hallucinations, confusing him with the angel of death. A voice inside his head told him to leave. Instead he wished the man good health and followed quietly behind the children into the bowels of the house. Nicola limped alongside him. In the second room they saw twin babies sleeping in the same cradle, their mouths open, a sliver of sunlight over them. One of the babies had a malformed lip. Identical twins who would never look alike. The children urged them to keep walking. Passing through a low-ceilinged, dim corridor they stepped into the backyard. The two apprentices were surprised to see how close they were to the Hagia Sophia. There was an empty chicken coop on one side. A rickety wooden door opened onto a patch of soil used as a toilet, its stench sharp. Beside that door was a brindled mother cat, her teats swollen, sprawled in a basket with 5 kittens of the same color. The girl took one of the kittens by the neck and pressed its nose against her skinny chest. The animal made no noise, smothered by love. Then, brusquely, she held the delicate creature up, and said, "Take it." "Oh, no. I can't do that." "Yours," she repeated. Jahan was equally stern. "I don't want a kitten." Her face collapsed. "They will die here." Seeing his sister's distress, the boy snatched the kitten and shoved it towards Jahan. The kitten, now panicking, scratched Jahan's thumb. Jahan flinched, but suppressed a yelp, and said, "I'm sorry. It's not in my hands to save your kitten." Shaken, the apprentices retraced their steps through the house and into the street, where a number of neighbors had gathered, having heard of their presence. Someone threw a stone, striking Nicola on his shoulder. The apprentices started to run. In their confusion they took a wrong turn. Dashing into a field, brambles tearing at their ankles. Their chests were heaving. Their senses on the alert, waiting for someone to leap at them from behind the bushes. When they slowed down, Nicola gasped, "I don't want to do this." "Nor I," Jahan said. Back on the construction site they found Davud working. When he saw them, a look of concern came over his face. "You well?" Jahan told him what had happened. "The sick man, the children, the babies. Don't let it affect you," said Davud. "They had no right to build that shed. But they had nowhere else to go. They'll be compensated. Our Sultan said so." Jahan said, "You know as well as I do that it won't be enough." "What can we do?" Davud murmured, running his fingers down his beard. "Our master entrusted us with the task." "Yes, and where is he now?" "Building the Sultan's mosque while we have to deal with this mess." No sooner had the words left him than Jahan halted, shaken by his own anger. "Forgive me." "I already have," said Davud with a brotherly smile. That week they delayed writing to Sinan, none of them feeling up to the task. They avoided one another, as if the more time they spent together the more they were reminded of their guilt. Then came a letter from the master. "My diligent apprentices, I would have been with you had I not been given the task of finishing our Sultan's mosque. Without delay. The urgency of the Salimiye mosque compelled me to leave you on your own. I did so knowing you were more than capable of taking care of the grand mosque of Hagia Sophia. Nonetheless, I'm aware that this is our hardest task. In our craft we seldom see people. We befriend stone quarries, converse with tiles, listen to marble. This time, however, you are face to face with the people whose homes you must demolish. This is onerous. If I could, I would have moved each of those families to a safer home with plenty of land and trees. But this is beyond me. And it is beyond you. Only remember that cities, too, are like human beings. They are not made of stones and wood solely. They are of flesh and bone. They bleed when they are hurt. Every unlawful construction is a nail hammered into the heart of Istanbul. Remember to pity a wounded city the way you pity a wounded person. May God grant you according to your desire and keep you balanced." Sinan, the humble and lowly pupil of Seth and Abraham, the patron saints of stonemasons and architects. That autumn the apprentices raised the countless hovels to the ground. Fast as they worked, the newcomers were faster. Even as they pulled down structures and moved away the rubble, in other parts of the city new buildings were set up. Equally unlawful, equally unsafe, and ugly. The regulations that Sinan developed regarding the width of the streets and the height of the houses were once again disregarded. Jahan was dismayed. Never before had he thought that among an architect's tasks would be the protection of the city from its inhabitants and the protection of the past from the future. The dome, that was what everyone raved about. In his letters to his chief royal architect, the Sultan demanded a dome bigger than that of the Hagia Sophia. His mosque would proclaim the triumph of Islam over Christianity and show the entire world who were the favorites in the eyes of God. All this talk made Jahan nervous. Much like their ruler, the people goaded the architects into a contest, pitting Sinan against Anthemius the mathematician and Isidorus the physicist. Who had designed the infidel church in days of yore? "Is there something bothering you?" asked Sinan. "You seem withdrawn." A fine film of sawdust covered their shoes and a thin veil of sweat shone on their foreheads. Although they were exhausted they kept working as if each day were their last. Jahan said, "I can't wait to finish and go." "We'll be done in 4 weeks, Allah willing," Sinan said, his voice trailing off. Even that was too long, yet Jahan did not object. He was ashamed of complaining when the master, over 80 years old, toiled from dawn to dusk. Despite their pleas he would not rest. Similar to a moth drawn to the fire, Sinan was attracted to the dust, dirt, and drudgery of construction sites. His hands rough, his fingernails split, underneath the silk kaftans he wore for ceremonies. He was a laborer to his core. It had an undeniable effect on his apprentices. The sight of him in the field, not unlike the sight of a commander at the battlefront, prompted everyone to keep working ever harder. "This mosque is wearing us out," Jahan said. Sinan grew pensive. "You've noticed it?" Not expecting his master to affirm his fears, Jahan stammered, "You know it? Think of a baby in the womb. She lives off her mother and tires her. While we deliver a building, we are like the mother. Once the baby is born, we shall be the happiest souls." The comparison between building and giving birth made Jahan smile. Yet, instantly he had another thought. "But I don't understand. The Sultan doesn't work with us. Why does it sap his strength?" "He is still attached to his mosque," said Sinan. "We've worked on other buildings. Bridges, mosques, madrasas, aqueducts. Why have I never felt this way before?" "You did, you just don't remember. That, too, is in the nature of things. We forget how we felt the last time." Again, like a mother. Sinan paused, as though unsure whether to say the next thing. "But then some births are harder than others." "Master, are you telling me that what we create can kill us?" "What we create can weaken us," said Sinan. "Rarely does it kill us." 3 weeks later, the Sultan sent a letter informing them that he wished to come and personally supervise the final touches to his mosque. He would travel to Adrianople leading a royal cavalcade. For this he needed an elephant. Since Mahmud had fallen out of favor and not yet clambered his way back up, Chota was, once again, in demand. With his master's blessing, Jahan took Chota and returned to the palace. He enjoyed seeing his old friends at the menagerie while the elephant rested in the barn. The next morning they were ready to join the procession. It was spectacular. The Janissaries, the elite guards and the archers, all were rigged out in bright colors. Several concubines accompanied the Sultan, seated inside heavily curtained carriages. There was excitement and pride in the wind. Underneath, however, there loomed disquiet, like dark clouds gathering in the distance on an otherwise bright and sunny day. The Christians, appalled by the loss of Cyprus and by their cathedrals being turned into mosques, had assembled a holy league. They sought revenge. The forces of the Pope, the Spanish and the Venetians, overcoming ancient feuds, had united. As they were making ready to journey to Adrianople, a naval battle between the Ottoman and Christian forces was underway in the Gulf of Corinth near Lepanto. In an hour Sultan Selim strutted out, his face round and red. After saluting the soldiers he motioned towards his horse, a purebred black stallion. That was when the strangest thing happened. The horse, for no reason at all, lurched forward and tripped. A gasp rose from the audience. It could only be a sign, an ill omen. Selim, visibly upset, ordered the horse to be taken back to the stable. He was not going to ride a jinxed animal. Swiftly, a substitute was found, Chota. Since the Sultan was bent on leaving the capital with grandeur and reaching Adrianople in much the same way, what better than an elephant to carry him? Jahan was ordered to prepare the howdah and the shiny, jingling headdress, which Chota disliked immensely. The Sultan held onto the dangling ladder and, with difficulty, managed to ascend. He was about to sit inside the howdah when Chota, either because the headdress had made him itchy or some demon had poked him in the eye, swayed his body with such force that the sovereign lost his balance. His turban, that huge mound with plumes, slipped off and plummeted, landing right in front of Jahan. Down below, grabbing it, the Mahout scrambled up the ladder. For the first time they were eye to eye, Jahan on the ladder, the Sultan inside the howdah. Jahan lowered his head. Still, for one fleeting instant, their gazes crossed. "My lord," Jahan said, as he held onto the rope with one hand and offered the turban with the other. "Give it here," Salim said, his voice tinged with irritation. The turban slipped from the Sultan's hand, toppling over yet again. Below on the ground the servants scurried to pick it up. They handed it to Jahan and he to the Sultan. This time Salim took it carefully, wordlessly, his face as pale as a cadaver's. He said, "You may go, Mahout." Jahan hurried down the ladder, tapped Chota's trunk. The animal hoisted him to his usual place on his neck. With prayers and praises they set forward. The people lined up on either side of the road and stared with admiration. Still, despite the splendor, discomfort had descended upon everyone. Other than the beat of hooves, the rattle of cartwheels and the jingle of the bells on Chota's headdress, there were no sounds. Jahan had never seen so many people making so little noise. Their spirits lifted as they left Istanbul behind. But dark news welcomed them. At the city gates of Adrianople, the entire Ottoman fleet had been lost in a humiliating, harrowing defeat. If Qiyamah had another name it would have been Lepanto. Hundreds were drowned, killed, enslaved. People were shocked, but that didn't last. After perplexity came discontent, and after discontent, rage. Suddenly everyone was seething at the Sultan. For the first time in years Jahan was afraid to walk on the streets. Once when Chota and he were out walking, someone threw a stone at them. Whizzing past Chota's head it crashed into a tree trunk. Jahan looked around, searching for the culprit. He saw a few boys playing knuckle bones, a hawker selling offal and pedestrians strolling along. It could have been any of them. In that moment he could not help thinking they were being held in contempt, for they were the Sultan's elephant and the Sultan's Mahout. The mood on the construction site, too, was somber. What had started with hope had turned into gloom, zeal and despair, might and loss. Cyprus and Lepanto. The Salimiyi, as though built upon an invisible pendulum, swung between opposites. And in the midst of everything was Master Sinan, unaffected, untouched, working. They carried on. The minarets were slender, graceful, and taller than any other they had seen or heard of. 4 tiers of windows on 3 galleries brought in ample light, reflecting off the tile panels, rendering the mosque bright and cheerful despite the workers' disposition. The sandstone facades were the color of honey, warm and inviting. The space inside was massive, uninterrupted. Wherever one knelt one could see the mihrab, where the imam sat and led the prayer. Everyone was equally close to God. Greek painters were brought from the island of Chios to help with the decoration. There was a Mohammedan artist, too, a dreamy man by the name of Nakash Ahmet Chalebi. Such was his regard for the mosque that he would come at different times of the day just to see, to admire. While out in the open sea, islands were captured, fleets were sunk, Muslims killed Christians and Christians killed Muslims, in Sinan's cocoon-like universe they work side by side. Supported by 8 piers of marble and granite, displaying 8 sides, the dome rested atop a square with semi-domes on each corner. As enchanting as it was, inside and outside, it was its size that everyone was curious about. Masters in the science of geometry joined forces with Taqiyuddin, the chief royal astronomer, and meticulously took measurements. They all wanted to know the answer: had their deep blue dome of heaven surpassed that of the Hagia Sophia? It had. If one were to measure from the level of the dome's base to the top, it was higher. The Selimiye Mosque's round dome, with its higher apex, had outdone the flat dome of Justinian's church. Yet it hadn't. If one were to calculate the distance from floor level to the top, theirs was lower and the Hagia Sophia's higher. Higher and lower simultaneously. And Jahan wondered, though he never could bring himself to ask, if, amid the flurry of excitement and anticipation, that was exactly what Master Sinan had intended. Marcantonio, the time-serving Bailo, was leaving Istanbul. He had spent 6 years under the Ottoman skies, and, unlike many a traveler into this land, had become, if only in a small way, an Istanbulite. Being a cordial person, he had friends galore, 2 of whom he held in high esteem, the Grand Vizier Sokollu and Sinan. For he was a man of letters, familiar with sculpture and architecture, this zesty emissary from Venice. Time and again he went to see Sinan, whose work, he declared, with a snap of his fingers and a hearty laugh, fabuloso. Sinan, too, visited him, despite those who frowned upon him for befriending an infidel. There was one more soul in the city of whom the ambassador had grown fond, Chota. Every time Marcantonio ran into Jahan he asked about the animals' health, bringing treats. Imbued with a spirit of inquiry, he interrogated Jahan about elephants, not as to what they ate nor how much they weighed nor how long they lived. Jahan was used to being asked such things. Marcantonio's questions were different. Was it true that elephants, like women, were prone to weeping when heartbroken? When the beast went to sleep, what, in Jahan's humble opinion, did he dream? Did he have a notion of an elephant self, or did he only grasp the world external to him? Unable to answer these questions, several times Jahan had let Marcantonio feed and ride Chota in the hopes that he might find the answers himself. On a fine day in spring Marcantonio appeared in the menagerie with 2 servants walking behind him and carrying a huge frame. A farewell gift for the Grand Vizier, the Bailo said with a roguish smile. May I take a peek? Jahan asked. When they pulled down the cloth, Jahan was surprised to see it was a painting of the Italian envoy clad in a turban and a kaftan. He sat on a sofa, not crossing one leg over the other like the Franks, but one leg folded backward and the other bent at the knee like the Ottomans. Through the open window in the background, one could view Istanbul, lush green hills, fluffy clouds, the bluest sea dotted with caiques. At first sight the portrait did not resemble the Bailo. Marcantonio had sallow, porous skin, whereas his painted image glowed with youth and health. The crook in his nose, the hair in his nostrils, the mole on his cheek that he powdered every day with care, had all been erased. It was as if by wearing the Ottoman garb and agreeing to pose for the painter he had slipped into another realm where everything was softer, brighter. At the bottom of the frame there was a dedication, Domino Muhammad Pishamu Sulmanarum Viziario Amico Optimo. The longer Jahan stared at the portrait, the more he felt it was alive. Slowly, the caiques began to glide into the sea, their oars splashing water, the clouds on the Horizon turning a fiery red. Then, gingerly, the man in the portrait rolled his eyes towards the balo, as if to assess how much they were alike. With a shudder, Jahan pulled down the cover. He was certain there was a spirit hiding in the frame, though he couldn't tell whether it was good or evil. On Wednesday, while the apprentices were busy working on a sketch, another gift arrived from Marcantonio, this one for Master Sinan. A box of carved rosewood encrusted with the golden initials MB. Inside was a leather-bound tome, 10 books on architecture, by Vitruvius. It was translated, with a commentary added, by none other than Marcantonio's brother. Even though he had studied the treatise before, Sinan was delighted to get this new edition in Italian. Clasping the box to his chest, he retreated to the library. But first he called for Jahan. "Come help me to read this." That, however, was not easy. Written in a refined, courtly Italian, Jahan found the text hard to interpret. Every sentence was a strain. Bit by bit, he was able to wade through the pages. Sinan listened carefully, his eyes narrowed in contemplation. Architecture was a science, the book said. It was based on 3 qualities: forza, strength, utilita, which Jahan translated as use, and bellezza, beauty. Tell me, which of these 3 would you sacrifice if you had to sacrifice one? Bellezza, Jahan replied assuredly. We can't compromise on strength or purpose. We could do without beauty, if need be. Sinan's face said otherwise. We can't give up beauty. Then which one should we sacrifice? None, Sinan said with a tender smile. If you give up one, you will end up losing all 3. Just then the Kaya's son rushed in, carrying a letter, which he said had been sent from the palace. Sinan broke the seal and read it, his eyes glittering with amber flecks. He said Sultan Selim was throwing a banquet for Marcantonio. A huge honor, no doubt, and one that showed the sovereign had been fond of the balo. How generous of our Sultan, Jahan commented. Well, it looks like you'll be there, too. Me. Jahan could not believe that his name was in a royal letter. Not quite, as it turned out. First, the letter was from Grand Vizier Sokollu. Second, it was not the mahout's name but the elephant's that was mentioned. Knowing how fond the balo was of the creature, Sokollu required Chota to entertain the audience on that evening. Jahan's heart sank. You're upset, said Sinan. I'm the apprentice to the chief royal architect, but the vizier sees me as a mahout. Cheer up, Sinan said. I'd like you to accompany me to the banquet. Once you've eaten, you can perform. Jahan gaped at him, barely containing his excitement. This meant he was to sup not with the tamers in the menagerie, waiting for his turn, but in the grand hall with the guests. Yet, instead of thanking him, he heard himself say, Chota doesn't know any stunts. He doesn't need to parade the animal. A simple trick will be enough. They want to see what God has created more than what you can make the elephant do. Even so, Jahan was distressed. Despite the passage of time, the catastrophe in the days of Hurrem Sultana was still fresh in his memory. Resentful though he was, he began to practice tricks with Chota. For the occasion the elephant had been given a new yellow mantle, and when he donned it, from a distance, he looked like a globe of fire. On his feet he wore anklets, silver circlets with 100 tiny bells. As soon as Jahan put them on Chota, the animal was perplexed. Taking a few awkward steps, he halted, walked again, stopped again. Unable to fathom where the noise was coming from. The afternoon of the big day, Jahan washed, brushed and oiled Chota tusk to tail. Then he put the mantle and the anklets on him. So handsome, Jahan cooed. If I were a lady elephant I'd fall for you. For a split second Chota's eyes, too small for his head, crinkled with mirth. In this state they passed through the gates into the inner courtyards. The evening started with a gift-giving ceremony. The Balo was given shawls, shoes, bejeweled belts, nightingales in gilded cages and a fat pouch, which contained 10,000 ixes. A murmur of appreciation rose as everyone commended Sultan Selim's generosity, even though he was yet to appear. The ambassador was ushered to the dining place. Inside a high-ceilinged chamber, 4 tables had been prepared for the most notable guests. Marc Antonio and the Grand Vizier and Master Sinan would be at the same table. The Sultan would be eating alone, as was the palace custom. Jahan thought about the Frankish kings and queens who always dined amid their retinue. He wondered which was better, their way or the Ottomans. Who would want to watch the monarch chewing on a chicken leg or chomping and belching like a mere mortal? Not seeing the Sultan at table only added to his respectability. Yet, at the same time, it made him more unreachable and, eventually, harder to understand. It was easier to love someone you shared bread with. Meanwhile the rest of the guests, including Jahan, were led into smaller rooms. About 50 boys, of similar height and size, dressed in green chalwar, began to serve. Deft and fast, they brought large, round trays and set them on wooden legs. Upon these they placed spoons and olives, pickles and spices in bowls so small no one would dare dip in a finger for fear of breaking them. Next, they carried basins and silver pitchers for everyone to wash their hands. Finally, they distributed towels and peskers for the guests to put on their laps and use to wipe their fingers. Knowing how important manners were, Jahan glanced left and right, observing what the others did. The worst sin you could commit at a banquet was gluttony. Even if it were your favorite dish, you had to eat slowly, showing no sign of greed. Jahan was careful to use the 3 fingers of his right hand without dripping oil. Mercifully there were others like him checking out what everyone else was doing. A few times their stares crossed and they nodded politely. They were served wheat soup with a hunk of dark bread, which was so filling. Jahan could have stopped eating there and then. But as soon as the crocks were taken away they were brought vine leaves stuffed with meat, rice with pine nuts, chicken kebab, chicken with mushrooms, buttered lamb, fried pigeons, roasted partridges, lamb's feet, goose stuffed with apples, brined anchovies, a huge red fish from icy waters up north, borek with shredded meat, egg with onions. They were served hashaf in bowls and lemonade in pitchers. His appetite now piqued by the delicious smells. Jahan tasted every dish. As they kept eating, the Sisnisi and Killer C walked around, making sure everything ran in perfect order. Then came the desserts: almond baklava, pear baked with ambergris, cherry pudding, ice crushed sweetened wild strawberries and heaps of honeyed figs. After dinner the guests collapsed outside onto the seats prepared for them. Fire eaters pranced around in their shiny jerkins, tumblers turned backwards. Somersaults, sword swallowers bolted down the sharpest blades. 3 brothers appeared, a semberbaz, who played with hoops, a shishabaz, who played with bottles, and a canbaz, who played with his life, doing a little caper on a cord stretched high above. When it was their turn, Chota and Jahan marched with feigned confidence. They performed, luckily without an incident, what few stunts they knew. Chota plucked the flower in Jahan's belt and gave it to the Balo, who accepted it with a happy laugh. Afterwards, the three of them, the master, the apprentice, and the animal, departed from the palace, each drawing into his thoughts. There was a sense of finality in the air. The Balo was going away, the summer was coming to an end. Sultan Selim had not emerged all evening, and there were rumors his health was deteriorating. It seemed to Jahan that, in truth, this world, too, was a spectacle. One way or another, everyone was parading. They performed their tricks, each of them, some staying longer, others shorter, but in the end they all left through the back door, similarly unfulfilled, similarly in need of applause. Shortly after the inauguration of the Selimiye Mosque, the Sultan was laid low by melancholia. Such was his gloom that he could not even delight in the great monument to his name. Jahan found it odd that the ordinary folks who prayed in the mosque revelled in its architecture and splendor more than the sovereign who had paid for it. It was the humors in his body that were causing him misery. He had too much black bile in his blood and, as a result, could not help feeling sad day and night. He had been duly cupped and bled, and made to take hellebore and vomit, but the sadness had not oozed away. In the company of his master, fellow apprentices and Chota, Jahan returned to Istanbul. With the white elephant he settled back in the menagerie. It was there, one afternoon in December, that the Sultan showed up. He brought with him a Sufi asterisk. Jahan was in the barn, checking the elephant's fodder. Lately a series of younger tamers had been appointed to take care of Chota, one after the other, but Jahan still saw to the animal's needs, making sure he was looked after. So it was there, as he was checking the standards of care, that he heard the Sultan and the Sufi wending their way through the rose gardens. He climbed up to the hayloft. Through a crack in the wooden planks he spied on them Selim's withered face. Had a sickly yellow hue, his beard was ragged, and he had put on more weight. His eyes were swollen. He must have been drinking again. Or else, Jahan realized with horror, crying. The Sultan and the Sufi sat on a stone bench near the cages of the wild cats. Jahan could not believe that the commander of the faithful and the successor of the prophet of the Lord of the universe had dropped himself down on that cold, grubby seat. Their voices were like the susurration of a river, and most of what they said he could not catch. Then he heard, spilling from the lips of Selim, "Is it true that Allah loveth the purifiers?" It was the Surah of Repentance, Jahan knew. The Sultan was so fond of the prayer that he had had it written in thuluth on the wall of a mosque he had commissioned in Konya. Jahan felt an immense sadness, which made him bolder than he normally would have dared. Leaving his hiding place, he went outside to welcome them. "How is the beast doing?" Selim asked, having never learned Jahan's name. "He is fine, my lord. Would your highness like to ride his elephant?" "Another day, Mahout," said Selim distractedly. There would be no other day. The same week, Selim fell down in the hammam and hit his head. They said he was drunk when he died. Others argued he was sober but so absent he hadn't seen where he was going. The son of a man too dominant, the ruler of an empire too vast, the bearer of a soul too tender, the dreamer of poems too delicate, Selim the sot, Selim the blonde, Selim the forlorn, left this world when he was 50 years of age. Nurbanu packed his body in ice, keeping his death a secret until her favorite son, Murad, arrived from his post in Anatolia. Sultan Murad ascended to the throne. He first had his brothers executed and then buried his father. Even though he loved an imposing mosque as much as every other ruler, he valued neither majesty like his grandfather Suleiman nor beauty like his father Selim. Neither forza nor bellezza. What mattered now was utility. Function over grandiosity. Function over beauty. From this day forth, nothing would be the same for Sinan and his 4 apprentices. One night in the menagerie they awoke to an awful din. A jumble of neighing, barking, grunting, bellowing and groaning rent the air. Throwing his blanket aside, Jahan sprang to his feet. The other tamers were also stirring. Taraz the Siberian, at ease in every calamity, was the first to walk out while the rest fumbled for their garments and boots. Groping like a blind man in the dark, Jahan stepped into the garden, where a wedge of moonlight glimmered shyly. There was a torrent of light pouring from above, a cascade in every shade of red. It took him a heartbeat to recognize what it was. Fire, someone shouted. Jahan was witnessing yet another blaze in the heart of the palace. The gardens, pavilions and passages, always so quiet you could hear the swish of your hair as you strode along, now pulsed with cries of help. The silence code dating back to the days of Sultan Suleiman had gone up in smoke. The calamity had broken out on the other side of the inner walls, along the eastern edge of the second courtyard. Jahan knew what was located there, the royal kitchens. The pantry, larder, butlery and cookhouse were smoldering. Just recently the master and the apprentices had repaired those buildings. Now they were burning. The flames had jumped westward, slowly but steadily engulfing the aviary. Jahan wondered if anyone had set the birds free. The thought of hundreds of pairs of wings flapping in horror, unable to take flight, pierced him to the quick. The first courtyard where they currently were was still untouched by the fire. Even so, the wind was strong, fickle. It blew in their direction every so often, bringing thick, grey ashes like dead butterflies. The smoke pricked their eyes, filled their lungs. The monkeys, seized by a fright larger than their reason, teeth bared, eyes glazed, were banging on the iron bars. The tamers had to move the menagerie to a place of safety. That, however, was no small feat. Underdurus animals were capable of the strangest behavior. The royal gardens, though not their native domain, was nevertheless home. Nobody could say how they would react when forced out of their cages into wooden crates. Having only a few carts at their disposal, the tamers could only proceed piecemeal, relocating a few animals at a time. Unprepared and baffled, they debated among themselves what to do. The Circassian grooms wanted to wait until they had received orders from the chief white eunuch. Another wave of fumes and cinders blowing in their direction was enough to silence them. There was no time to lose. First they moved the apes. Not because they were more valuable but because no one could stand their ruckus. Next Jahan led Chota out of the barn. Wise soul that he was, Chota did not cause any problem. If anything, he was helpful. Complacent. He didn't mind pulling the carriage on which they placed the monkeys and gorillas, many of them shrieking and jumping up and down, tottering like unruly drunkards. The creatures that could trot out were allowed to do so: horses, camels, zebras, giraffes, gazelles, and reindeer. Fearing that a sudden noise could startle them into a stampede, the tamers were careful, alert. They tied the animals to one another by the neck, making a caravan of unlikely companions. Some mounted on horses, others on carts. The trainers followed their animals. Despite their care, no sooner were they beyond the palace walls than the zebras, as though jinxed, bolted down the hills, dragging the rest of the caravan with them. The tamers shot after them like demons. Drenched in sweat and dust and curses, they managed to rein in the zebras before they caused the entire herd to tumble over, one on top of another. With the help of sticks and nets, treats, and threats, they loaded the royal animals onto carts. Off went the snakes, chameleons, ostriches, turtles, raccoons, weasels, peacocks and the terrified llamas. Next came the foxes, hyenas, panthers, and leopards. They transported them outside the palace gates and down the slopes towards an opening by the quay, unsure how far the flames were capable of reaching. The elephant and the mahout made several round trips, bringing fodder and water for the animals. When they were done, Jahan placed a basket of leaves in front of Chota, leaving him in the care of the Chinese twins, and returned to the menagerie for a last inspection. This was partly because of an old habit. True. Since Captain Gareth had disappeared he had stopped stealing, but, like every thief, he knew that a fire was an unmissable opportunity to chance on unexpected riches. But this was not the only reason for his return. He was thinking about Mirama. For a while after the demise of her brother Salim she had not visited the palace. But tonight she, too, was in the harem. Was she frightened? Jahan wondered. He thought about her nursemaid, who must be having a terrible time breathing with her asthma. In a couple of hours, for all he knew, the flames could reach their chamber. He wanted to be sure they were fine and safe. The guards at the gate were too distracted to pay him any attention. By now, the blaze had drawn closer, lapping over the walls towards the rose gardens, embers leaping in a sprinkle of gold. When he reached the enclosure of the wild cats, Jahan was surprised to see the lions were still locked up, 2 females and 1 male. The mighty beasts, restless and tense, paced up and down, growling at something in the distance as though faced with an enemy only they could detect. Outside the cage stood Olef. Perky as usual, he yelled, "Hey, Indian! Why did you come back? Just wanted to see if everything was all right. You need a hand. My girls are scared, my boy doesn't want to come out. I'll have to drag them. Don't want the poor things burned to a crisp." Smiling at his own joke and without a weapon to protect him, Olef opened the iron door and entered the cage. Jahan watched him approach one of the females, talking in a calm, steady tone. The cat stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the tamer's every gesture. Gingerly, Olef placed a hoop around her neck and carefully led her out. He ushered her up a plank and into a wooden crate placed on a cart. Next he moved the second lioness in the same way. As she walked out, the male stared from a corner, his eyes 2 slivers of dark citron. The back of Jahan's neck felt hot. Apprehension began to creep over him. Dawn was breaking in the distance. There was something on Olef's face that hadn't been there before. The slightest quiver in his nostrils, a twitch of his mouth. It was the 2 of them in the cage, the tamer and the lion. In his hand, Olef held a rope, limp and listless, as if he didn't know what to do with it. For the first time Jahan saw him hesitate. The lion snarled, no more than an inaudible growl, as if he, too, were caught between opposing urges. Heart racing, Jahan grabbed a club and put one foot into the cage. "Step back," Olef said. "Go away." Drawing a breath, Jahan did as he was told. "Close the door." This, too, Jahan did. He felt numb, unable to think properly. Olef's flame-colored ponytail came loose, spreading out on his collar. He wiped the sweat off his brow, momentarily distracted. In that instant the lion turned to him with Another snarl, as though he had just noticed him, as though this wasn't the man who had taken care of him for years, feeding him every day before he fed himself. The beast lifted his paw, his claws stretched open, he sprang on the man. Olaf fell down. There was not a trace of pain on his face, only astonishment. The look of a father disappointed in his son. Outside the cage Jahan dashed about like a madman, waving his arms, shouting. The club still in one hand, he hit the bars of the cage in the hope of distracting the lion. It worked. Pulling back, the animal took a few steps towards Jahan. In the meantime, Olaf stood up, unsteady. Instead of walking towards the door, he edged nearer to the cat, calling him. It happened so fast. Like a dream. Jahan watched it occur, in front of his eyes. The lion, now taking his gaze off Jahan, turned back and pounced at his tamer, fastening his jaws on Olaf's neck. Jahan screamed, his voice that of a stranger. He smashed the club, kicked the bars, shouted at the cat. Finding a cudgel nearby, he ran back, too terrified to remember to pray. He went into the cage. There was a pool of blood where Olaf lay. The lion, having lost interest in him, had returned to his corner. Slowly, not moving his gaze from the cat, though unsure what he would do should he spring, Jahan hauled the wounded man outside. Olaf's eyes were open, flicking about. His throat spurting blood. His neck had been torn open, his jugular vein ripped. As soon as he dragged him out, Jahan closed the door. He didn't care if the flames reached the lion. He wanted him to burn. They buried Olaf in a graveyard not that far from the seraglio. The male lion, despite Jahan's wish, had survived. As it turned out, the flames never reached the menagerie and all their efforts had been for naught. The royal kitchens were reduced to ashes together with parts of the harem and the privy chamber. Sinan and the apprentices would have to rebuild them all over again. After Olaf's funeral, attended only by the animal tamers and equerries, something came over Jahan. He was seized by a presentiment, as if, in one death, he had seen the deaths of them all. He raged deep inside, not at the lion that had killed a friend but at everyone else, at himself, for leaving Olaf on his own in that cage and acting too late, at the new Sultan, for not giving a tinker's curse about his servants perishing while serving him, at Master Sinan, who, unaffected by disasters, kept making building after building, at God, for allowing them to err and suffer so yet still expecting them to pray in gratitude. Yes, the world was beautiful, a beauty that irritated him. What difference did it make whether they were hurt or happy, right or wrong, when the sun rose and the moon waned just the same, with or without them? The one creature he did not take umbrage at was Chota, and he spent as much time as possible beside him, soothed by his calmness. The anger was not all. Something else accompanied it, an ambition he had never known before. There was a part of him that wished to defy not only the master who had made him his apprentice, the Sultan who had made him his mahout, and the god who had made him weak, but most of all Miramah, who, during all these years, had made him a silent sufferer. He worked hard, spoke little. This, more or less, was his mood when Sinan and the three other apprentices arrived at the palace to, once again, repair the damage. We'll add new baths and pavilions by the shore, Sinan said. The harem and the privy chamber need to be repaired. We shall enlarge them again. Everything we build ought to match the spirit of the building. He paused for a moment. I want you to draw a plan. Whoever brings me the best, shall be my chief assistant. Jahan was surprised to hear this. Until this day they had been treated as equals, even when they knew they were not. Now their master was making them compete against one another. He knew he should have been thrilled. Except his heart was not in it. Still, he worked, though not beside the other apprentices in the shade of the gardens. He went to the barn, sat next to Chota and finished his sketches there. A few days later Sinan wanted to talk to him, urgently. Jahan saw that he had placed the designs side by side, all four of them. Come, he said. I want you to look at these and tell me what you see. Not knowing which scroll belonged to whom, Jahan inspected the three drawings. He compared each with his own. It seemed as if he alone had proposed knocking down the baths and building them anew at the back of the harem. Even though Mirama no longer lived there, he had made his design with her comfort in mind. As he studied the sketches, he began to recognize the purposeful strokes of Davad, the meticulous tracing of Nicola and the light flowing hand of Yusuf. What do you think? Sinan asked. Uneasily, Jahan pointed out the best in each drawing. Sinan said, I know what their strengths are. Tell me their weaknesses. This one was hastily done, Jahan said. The other, he explained, in his desire to copy his master, had not contributed from his soul. How about this? Sinan asked, showing Jahan his own scroll. I like that it cares about the harem population and makes it easier for them. Jahan felt his face burn. But it takes no notice of the surroundings. There's no harmony between the new additions and the old structure. Sinan's eyes glimmered. He took out the last design. And this? Careful, balanced. He's respected the building and expanded it in proportion. That's right. What I'd like to know is why your design, which is the better one, pays no attention to the palace. Jahan's face clouded over. I cannot say, master. Yours was the best, but it had one flaw. We do not raise buildings that float in empty space. We reflect the harmony of nature and the spirit of the place. Thus the mute apprentice became the chief assistant. Blushing up to his ears, a shy smile hovering on his lips, Yusuf kept his gaze on the ground, as if he wanted to disappear therein. As for Jahan, he had learned something about himself, that he had reached a point in his craft where he could either improve or destroy his talent. Davad, Yusuf, Nicola, these were not his rivals. His most fearsome rival was none other than himself. They spent the summer expanding the palace and repairing the areas where the fire had wreaked havoc. Accustomed as they were to toiling on all sorts of sites, this one felt different and oddly quiet. For once there was no idle talk among the laborers, no jokes or quips as they carried the planks, hoisted the pulleys or ate their soup. When they erected an uncut marble column, dozens of men pulling at once, the hussars slashing their palms, there were no shouts of Allah, Allah. Just as there were no words of praise from the foreman when one of them did a fine job, intent less on commending than on prodding everyone else to toil harder. Even the sounds of the mallets, saws and axes were less ear-splitting than usual. An awkward silence descended on everything, leaving them dazed, as if they had just woken up from a slumber. Such was the impact of being close to Sultan Murad. During those weeks Jahan met servants he had never come across before and learned about halls he had not known existed. The palace was a maze of rooms. Within rooms and paths that drew circles, a serpent swallowing its tail. It was lonely enough to make you love your own shadow and crowded enough to leave you gasping for air. There were far more people under its roof than at the time of Sultan Suleiman, more women in the harem, more guards at the gates, more pages serving more dishes. Like a fish that couldn't sense when it was full, the palace kept absorbing more and more. Once the apprentices finished rebuilding the kitchens, they started the additions to the outer part of the harem. The concubines, having retreated into the inner chambers, were out of sight. Jahan hoped to see, if not Miramah, then something that belonged to her, a handkerchief with her initials, a velvet slipper, an ivory comb. None of these he found. A few days later Miramah sent him word. She and Dada were going back to her mansion. At midday we shall be passing by the first gate. Seated on one of the higher branches of an apple tree, Jahan waited, elated and terrified. In the drowsy heat the sun glowed through the ripe fruits, which nobody dared pick because they belonged to the Sultan, who had no time for such trifles. Jahan flinched at a distant rattle. A carriage appeared, moving slowly. It seemed to Jahan that he and only he had reached a standstill while the world had moved on. Everything was familiar in a strange way. Next to the vastness of the universe his heartbeat was inaudible. He was an observer. No more. The leaves rustled, the slugs inched forward, a moth's wings beat in the breeze. Jahan savored every detail, sensing he would never have this moment again. Time became a river. He stood by the grassy bank and stared at the water flowing by, alone and forsaken. The carriage came to a stop. A hand, as graceful as a bird, fluttered out of the window and pulled the curtain aside. Miramah looked up to where Jahan was perched, her face softening as she took in his adoring gaze. She saw one more time that, despite the decades and the distances, and the wrinkles and the graying hair, nothing between them had changed. Jahan took a long look at her, without averting his eyes or bowing his head, he stared straight into her eyes. Her lips curled into a tender smile and she blushed a little. She pulled out a handkerchief from her bosom, smelled its perfume, glanced up at him and then dropped it for him to come and fetch afterwards. It was a sweltering afternoon during Ramadan, fasting had slowed them down. Jahan didn't mind the hunger that much, but the thirst was killing him. No matter how many cups of water he drank at Sahur * as soon as he came to the site the next morning his mouth felt dry as dust. Hours later, unable to bear it any more, he would steer towards the back of the kitchens, where there was a fountain. He would rinse his mouth to get rid of the rusty taste. If he swallowed a few drops at the same time, so be it. It was a sin, cheating like this. Yet he was hoping God wouldn't mind if he consumed a few droplets of his endless water. As he headed towards the fountain, Jahan noticed a figure ahead of him. Fast and furtive, it disappeared amid the bushes. He recognized the mute apprentice and began to follow his steps. He decided now was the time to talk to him to find out if he was the traitor. Yusuf went straight to the pond where Chota would refresh himself now and then. He sat there, his face impossible to read. At first, Jahan thought he, too, had come here to quench his thirst. But all he seemed to be doing was staring at his reflection in the water, sad and subdued, as though he had just departed from someone he dearly loved. Jahan watched him for a while. So quiet and distracted was Yusuf that, save for the movement of his hands and the occasional glance he threw in the direction of the construction site, he might have been inanimate. Another queer creature in the chief white eunuch's collection. Then, as though in a dream, he took off his gloves. His hands were slender and white, without a trace of burns. Why had he lied to everyone, Jahan wondered. What happened next was more baffling. Yusuf began to hum a song. His voice, the voice no one had ever heard, was lilting, dulcet. Realizing he had stumbled on something dark, something he would not know what to do with, Jahan held his breath, studying the apprentice who, all this time, he had taken for dumb. Yusuf fell quiet again, the moment disappeared. Jahan tried to retreat discreetly, but in his haste he stepped on a twig. With a flinch Yusuf turned and saw him. His face fell, his lip jutted out like a child. So deep was his panic that Jahan almost ran to him to say not to worry, he would not reveal his secret. Instead he went back to work and tried to put the whole thing out of his mind. Still, he could not help glancing at Yusuf, who kept his head bowed low, his eyes fixed on the ground. That evening after supper Jahan allowed himself to mull over the mystery. The hairless face, the long, curved eyelashes, the way he sat demurely with his gloved hands resting upon his lap. It was all beginning to make sense. The next morning he found Yusuf covered in soot and powder, drawing. Upon seeing Jahan, he darkened, his back stiffening. "I'd like to talk," Jahan said. "Come with me, I beg." Yusuf followed him. They walked silently until they found a shady spot under a tree. They sat on the ground, cross-legged. Jahan cleared his throat. "I always envied you. You have a gift. No wonder Master picked you as his chief apprentice." They were distracted by a passing porter carrying a basket of stones on his back. Once his footsteps faded away, Jahan went on. "But you were acting strangely. I suspected you'd had a hand in the accidents." Yusuf's face crumpled in surprise. "Now I understand there was a reason why you were secretive. You are not mute. You have been hiding your voice because you are a woman." Her eyes clutched at his, wide and frightened, as though Jahan were an apparition. Her lips moved, empty of sound at first, a voice that had not been used for so long it faltered like a chick learning to fly. "Will you tell anyone?" "Well, I'm not trying." Her hands trembling, she cut in, "If you tell, it'll be the end of me." Jahan looked at her in awe and nodded slowly. "I give you my word." Discovering the mute apprentice's secret had made Jahan curious not only about her but also about Sinan. He was certain his master knew. What's more, he suspected it had been his idea all along. Sinan wanted, allowed, and encouraged her to work with them, a woman among hundreds of laborers, year after year, building after building. The whole week he pondered this dilemma. In the end he went to see him. "Indian apprentice," Sinan said brightly. "You have something to ask, I can tell. I'd like to know, if I may, how you choose your apprentices." "I pick them from among the skillful. There are many such in the palace school. They'd make better draftsmen." Some might. Sinan left the sentence hanging. "I used to think we were the best students you had come across. My vanity. Now I understand we have talent but we are not the finest." "You do not choose the finest. You go for the ones who are good but are," he halted, searching for the word. "Lost, abandoned, forsaken." It was a moment before Sinan spoke. "You're right. I choose my apprentices with care. Those with aptitude but also with nowhere to go." "Why?" Sinan drew in a slow breath. "You have been to the sea, the big sea." Though not a question, Jahan nodded. "Have you ever seen sea turtles washed ashore? They keep walking, with all their might, but the route is a wrong one. They need a hand to turn them back towards the sea, where they belong." Sinan pulled at his beard, which had whitened a great deal in the past months. When I saw you, I thought you had a great head on your shoulders, and would learn fast, if only I could turn you away from wrong habits, from the past, and direct you towards your future. As Jahan listened to his master, he found the word he was looking for, broken. He was beginning to understand what Sinan was doing, what he had been doing all along. Jahan, Davad, Nicola, and Yusuf. The four of them, utterly different yet similarly broken. Master Sinan was not only teaching them, he was also, gently but firmly, fixing them. Jahan kept his word. He did not share Yusuf's secret with anyone, not even Chota, seized by a superstition that it would pass on from the animal to the howdah, from the howdah to the people he carried. Gradually, during breaks, Yusuf told him her story, or what remained of it, and her name of many summers ago, Sancha. There was a big, milky white house covered in wisteria, she said, in a town called Salamanca. Her father was a renowned man of medicine. Tender with his patients, strict with his wife and children, he wished nothing more than to see his three sons continue his noble profession. He insisted that his daughter, too, should be educated. As a result, every tutor who came to the house taught all four children. The summer she turned 8, the plague entered through the city gates. Death claimed the boys one after the other. Only Sancho was left, burdened with the guilt of being alive when those who were more beloved had gone. Her mother, numb with grief, sought refuge in a convent in Valladolid. Only Sancha and her father were left. She took care of him, though he clearly despised her efforts. Even so, little by little, he began to teach her not medicine, since he believed that women were by nature incapable of this, but other disciplines. Arithmetic, algebra, philosophy. He taught her everything he knew. Being a good student, she learned fast, at first less out of her thirst for knowledge than in the hope of earning her father's love. In time, she had better tutors. There was one architect, old and in penury, who spent a great deal of time instructing her, and in between lessons tried to steal kisses from her. Her father had friends like himself, men who cherished wisdom, conversos, and Catholics, and an Arab among them. Still, there was plenty of fear and suspicion. Heretics were burned at the stake, the stench of smoldering flesh polluting the wind. Her father, whose health had begun to deteriorate, declared that in a year she would be married to a distant cousin, a wealthy merchant she had never met before and already hated. Pleading, crying, she tried to convince him not to send her off, but to no avail. The ship she took to meet her fiancé was raided by corsairs. After weeks of suffering, none of which she wished to remember, she found herself in Istanbul, enslaved. She was sold to a court musician who happened to be an acquaintance of Sinan. The man was a gentle soul and treated her well, allowing her, upon her request, to have pen and paper. His two wives, however, tormented her every day. Jealous of her youth and beauty, they bitterly complained that she did not help them the way a concubine should. They had checked her head to toe and could verify that she had no parts missing, but still they doubted she was a woman. Even though she had been converted to Islam and renamed Nurjais, she was secretly drawing Christian churches with crosses and bells. The musician listened to their carping, but not even once did he ask to see the sketches to which they referred. One day, while the musician was away on a journey, his wives ripped Sancha's drawings to pieces and beat her so badly that her clothes were torn to tatters. The same evening he returned. Her fate might have been different had he been back a few days later, when her bruises had healed. As it was, he saw her marred face, swollen eyes. He also found the shredded sketches. One of them had escaped intact. Taking this, he showed it to Sinan. To his surprise, the chief royal architect was impressed and keen to meet the owner of the drawing. The musician explained to Sinan that it belonged to a concubine of his, a young damsel, though no longer a virgin, pretty as sunshine, whom he was happy to give to Sinan as a gift. He could do with her what he pleased. If the girl remained in his house, his wives would trample on her like a shoddy rug. That was how Sancha ended up in the chief royal architect's house. She was allowed to use the library and make her sketches so long as she helped Kara, the master's wife, with the housework from morning till noon. A year into this life, Sinan began to tutor her. He was pleased with this unlikely pupil, yet never considered taking her to construction sites. The week Sinan laid the foundation stone for the Shehzade Mosque, Sancha begged to be allowed to work with him. Refused repeatedly, she took hold of a pair of scissors and cut her long hair, the color of burnt umber, which she left in a pile at the master's door. When Sinan came out the next morning, he stepped on a silky turf of hair. He understood. He provided her with boy's clothes. When she put them on, he was half amused and half astounded. She could easily pass as a lad. The only obstacle was her voice and her hands. It could be solved by silence and a pair of gloves. Sinan decided she would be his mute apprentice. Sancha told Jahan all of this one afternoon while they were working on the Molla Salebi Mosque. A hexagonal domed bald achin, 4 turrets with domical caps. The two of them sat outside on a bench facing the half-dome over the mihrab. No one knows? Jahan asked. The master's wife, Kara. She does. Who else? Only one, said Sancha. This Italian architect, Tommaso. He is always following our master. He heard me speak once, I'm afraid. Jahan was about to reply when he caught a sound like that of a nocturnal animal rustling off to the side. He turned back with fright. There was an eerie quiet, and he sensed, with all his being, that they had not been alone. His heart thudding against his chest, he stood up, glanced around. He saw a few men in the distance, prowling around. One of them he recognized. It was Salahaddin's brother. Jahan remembered their bitter exchange at the cemetery. He knew the young man hated Sinan, holding him responsible for his brother's death. Jahan feared he might have come here to harm the master. Then again, they could be thieves. There were always a few around construction sites, looking for materials to loot. Not wanting to alarm Sancha and add to her distress, he watched the intruders a bit longer and kept his suspicions to himself. I saw you with Tommaso, Jahan said after a pause. A shadow crossed his face as a new thought occurred to him. He is blackmailing you. Sancha lowered her eyes. But you are not rich. What does he want from you? He is not after riches, Sancha said, twisting the end of her shirt between her fingers. He wants the master's designs. Jahan looked at her in horror. Did you give them to him? All he's got is a few mediocre designs. He thinks they belong to master Sinan. I drew them for him. A smile passed between them. A sense of fellowship, which, had Jahan not known the truth about her, he would have called brotherhood. What Sancha didn't say, then or later, and it would take Jahan a while to discover, was that there was a secret buried in her heart. It had kept her strong and loyal to the core. On the loneliest nights when she cried herself to sleep, the thought of him being under the same roof, even if a life away, the thought of him caring for her, even if in a fatherly way, had warmed her soul. She was his apprentice. She was his concubine. She was his slave. And she was no older than his daughter. Yet Yusuf Nurjai Sancha Garcia de Herrera, a soul who carried too many names in her slender body, was in love with Master Sinan. They never found another chance for a talk as intimate and honest as this one. The same day a new accident occurred. A stone block slipped off the pier, abutting the prayer hall, and fell to the ground, wounding 2 galley slaves and killing Sinan's dedicated foreman, Snowy Gabriel. The accidents were sporadic enough to be attributed to fate, but they were also strangely similar, strangely persistent. If not put to use, iron rusts, woodwork crumbles, man errs, Sinan said. Work we must. Following in his footsteps, the 4 apprentices toiled as though tomorrow were the day of judgment and they must finish before everything turned to dust. They constructed Friday mosques, masjids, madrasas, Quran schools, bridges, baths, hospitals, lazarettos, almshouses, granaries, and caravanserais for travelers from far and wide. Most of these were ordered by the Sultan, others by his mother, wives, daughters, and succeeding viziers. Not everything Sinan built was commissioned by the wealthy and the mighty. However, the shrines, to begin with, these, too, the apprentices put up in earnest. Many a time their master paid for these himself. And the sole reason they kept erecting them year in, year out, was because someone somewhere had seen them in a dream. Sinan, in his capacity as the master of the royal architects, not only felt responsible for raising structures and surveying towns. He also oversaw holy dreams. Anybody could come with such a demand, a soldier, an innkeeper, a scullion, even a mendicant. They knocked on Sinan's door, respectful but resolute, and secretly proud, as though they had been entrusted with an important letter from the skies. Then they related their dreams. More often than not, these were about saints and sages who were terribly upset that their graves had gone to rack and ruin. Or martyrs who, showing where their remains lay, asked for a proper funeral. Or mystics executed for heresy and buried furtively, if at all. The dead in the visions were impatient, their behests urgent. So were the dream petitioners, as Jahan called them. They expected the architect and the apprentices to stop doing whatever they were doing, such as building a Friday mosque, and follow them. Some even made threats. It's a powerful saint, this one. If you don't do as he says, he'll put a curse on you. Every week one of the apprentices was put in charge of the dream suitors. His impossible task was to listen to everyone and weed out those who were honest from the crooks. This is how many a Thursday afternoon Jahan found himself perched on a stool facing strangers. There would be a scribe by his side, bent over the table, scratching his pen without a break. No matter how full of gibberish or trivia, every appeal had to be written down. Sinan would greet the petitioners cordially. He would announce that his wise apprentice was here to hear what they had to share. Flicking a sideways glance in Jahan's direction, he would leave with an impish smile at the edge of his lips. Under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes, studying his every move, Jahan often broke into a sweat. The room felt small, stuffy. Suddenly there was not enough space for these people and their vast expectations. They came from everywhere. Bustling ports and forsaken hamlets. And they implored the apprentices to go and build everywhere, a town, a farmstead, or a property home only to snakes. Most of the dream petitioners were men of varying ages. There were schoolboys accompanied by their fathers. Occasionally, there would be a woman. She would wait outside while her husband or brother passed on her dreams. Once some peasants requested that a Byzantine fountain, which supplied water to a village, be restored. Although they had applied to the cadi, their efforts had so far been in vain. Then a tinker had a holy dream. A forceful and furious saint confided in him that beneath the fountain lay the remnants of a Sufi Durga. As long as the water kept flowing, the souls of the dervishes rested in peace. Now that the water had run dry, they were disturbed. Therefore the fountain had to be repaired, without delay. When Jahan offered his master an account of his interviews, Sinan singled out this story as one to which they should give serious attention. But, master, do you believe they are telling the truth? Jahan objected. They need water, it doesn't matter what I believe. They rebuilt the fountain, cleaning the ditches that brought water from the mountains. The villagers were pleased, so was Sinan. It was around this time that a miller arrived. He said that while grinding grain, he had heard a woman singing, sweet and captivating. Fearing it must be a jinn, he had headed for the hills. The next day the voice awaited him, although he had thrown salt over his left shoulder and spat 3 times on fire. The village elder advised him to read the Quran before going to sleep. This he did. That same night a woman appeared in his dream. Her face shone as if there were a lantern under her skin. Her lustrous, blonde hair spilled onto her shoulders. She explained that she had been strangled upon the orders of the mother Sultana, though she did not give her name. Since then her soul had been roaming the earth, searching for her body, which was deep under the sea. Recently a fisherman had pulled up the tortoise-shell comb that had been on her head and come loose when she was thrust into the sea with a rock tied to her feet. Not knowing what to do with it, the fisherman had put it in a box. She wanted the miller to find the comb and bury it as though it were her flesh and bone. In this way, she would have a tomb and find some peace. Why didn't she reveal herself to the fisherman? Jahan asked incredulously. He's trouble, the miller said. He lives a stone's throw away from Rumelian Castle. There's a cottage, blue like a robin's egg. Have you been there? Of course not, Effendi. She told me all that. I'm a poor man, my wife's ailing. I've got no sons to lend me a hand. I can't ride that far. Jahan understood what was being asked of him. I can't go either. I'm needed here. The disappointment in the man's eyes went through Jahan like a flamed arrow. Still, his biggest surprise came when Sinan, once he told him the story, urged Jahan to go to nose around. So, the next day, the elephant and the mahout were on their way. Finding the fisherman was easy, speaking to him, impossible. With eyes dark, with bitterness and a mouth that clearly hadn't smiled in ages, he was a callous soul. One look at him and Jahan knew there was no way he would let him rummage through his belongings. Jahan made another plan. As soon as they were behind the hills, he halted the elephant and jumped down. After tying Chota to a willow, which the animal could have pulled up without much effort, he said, I'll be back in a moment. Quiet as an owl, Jahan retraced his path. He tiptoed around the garth and into the shed, which stank of fish. He found a few boxes but none of them had a comb inside. He was about to leave when he caught sight of a basket on the floor. His hands shaking, he peered into it. The comb was there. Mottled brown. And amber, cracked at the edges. He pocketed it and took to his heels. Thankfully Sinan didn't inquire how the article had been acquired. Instead he said, "We need to lay her to rest. She needs a tombstone." "But, can we bury a comb in place of a body?" asked Jahan. "If it's the only thing left from a person, I don't see why not." By a mulberry tree, Sinan and the apprentices dug deep. They placed the comb inside. As they threw earth on the grave, they prayed. In the end, the woman in the miller's dream, whether real or not, had a headstone. One that said, "Pray for the soul of one whose name was not discovered. Loved by the Almighty, he hath known her always." In the spring of 1575 the astronomer Taqiyuddin began to visit Sinan more often. The two of them would retreat to the library, talking for hours. There was something new and big in the air. Jahan could sniff it out like freshly baked bread, something that excited these elderly men as though they were boys. Again, the chief royal astronomer and the chief royal architect had always respected each other. Time and again, Taqiyuddin had been present at the inauguration ceremony of a mosque, helping with the measurements. Likewise, he consulted Sinan about the laws of arithmetic, on which both were experts. The two men read effortlessly in several languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Latin and a bit of Italian. Over the years they had exchanged a multitude of books and ideas and, Jahan suspected, quite a few secrets. If their fondness for numbers was one thing they had in common, another was their diligence. Both believed that the only way to thank Allah for the skills He had given them was to labor hard. Despite everything they shared, they could not have been more different. Taqiyuddin was a man of passion. His face was an open book that revealed every emotion crossing his heart. When joyful, his eyes lit up; when thoughtful, he fingered his rosary so hard that the string would almost snap. In his obsession with learning he was rumored to have hired grave robbers to bring him corpses to study. Should anyone ask why a stargazer might show interest in the human body, he would say God had designed the small cosmos and the big cosmos in parallel. He often complained about the arrogance of the ulama and the ignorance of the people. With so much fire in his spirit it caused his friends no small amount of worry that he might burn himself. Fervent and animated, he stood in contrast with Sinan, who rarely showed his fervor and had, overall, a placid demeanor. Except now Sinan, too, seemed excited, if not apprehensive. He spent his days reading and drawing, which was normal, but he also looked out of the window in a distant and distracted way, which was not. A couple of times Jahan heard him ask the servants whether anyone had brought him a message. One Wednesday, as the apprentices were working in the master's house, the awaited courier arrived with a scroll. Under prying eyes, Sinan broke the seal. "Read the letter." His face, stiff with suspended eagerness, softened into a smile of relief. "We are building an observatory," he announced. "A house to study the dark expanse above their heads. It would be bigger than any that had been erected before, east and west. Astronomers from all over the world would come here to hone their skills." Sultan Murad had promised to support Taqiyuddin in his wish to discover the invisible dome. "This will alter our grasp of the universe," Sinan remarked. "Why would it concern us?" asked Davud. In response Sinan said that knowledge, ilm, was a carriage pulled by many horses. If one of the steeds began to gallop faster, the other horses, too, would speed up and the traveler in the carriage, the alim, would benefit from it. Improvement in one field backed improvements in other fields. Architecture had to be friends with astronomy, astronomy with arithmetic, arithmetic with philosophy, and so on. One more thing, Sinan said. You are going to build the observatory. I shall look after you, but it will be your achievement. The apprentices gaped at him in disbelief. They had worked upon many buildings but had never created one on their own. Nicola said, Master, we are indebted. You have honored us. May God light your path, said Sinan. In the weeks ahead the apprentices presented their designs to the master. Having been given a site on a hill in Tofane, they checked the soil, measured the moisture. Even though still vying with one another to be the master's favorite, they joined forces. The excitement of building together outweighed any jealousies. Taqiyuddin, in the meantime, was the happiest soul in the empire and the most restless. Hovering about the site, asking questions that made no sense to anyone. He could barely wait to see the completion of his beloved observatory. Weeks into the construction, he was seized by a fear of death. Morbidly fascinated with accidents and diseases, he was afraid of departing this life before the edifice was finished. Never before had Jahan seen an intelligent man drive himself so mad with worry. Instruments were brought from near and far. Books and celestial maps were gathered for the collection to be housed inside the observatory. Round and spacious, flooded with light pouring through high windows, with a staircase that spiraled down into a basement chamber, the library was a place Jahan was fond of, and he was proud of having contributed to its design. As the construction progressed, Jahan was able to learn more about Taqiyuddin. Born in Damascus, schooled in Nablus and Cairo, he had then settled in Istanbul, trusting it to be the right city for his skills. Here he had thrived, climbing all the way up to the rank of chief royal astronomer. Jahan would later learn that it was he who had instigated this whole venture, convincing the Sultan of the necessity for a royal observatory. That, however, did not mean he had persuaded everyone in the court. Hugely respected by some, loathed by others, of friends and foes, Taqiyuddin had plenty. Benefiting from the findings of the mathematician Jamshid al-Kashi and the tools perfected by Nasir al-Din al-Tasi, Taqiyuddin was keen on furthering the achievements of the Samarkand Observatory, built by Ulugh Bey, an astronomer, a mathematician, and a sultan. Almost 200 years ago, he said, the finest scholars had unraveled many secrets of the universe. Their accomplishments, rather than being refined, had been forsaken and forgotten. Precious knowledge had been lost for future generations. There were gems of wisdom, far and wide, waiting to be found, like caskets of treasure deep under the ground. Learning, therefore, was a matter less of discovering than of remembering. Taqiyuddin often alluded to Tycho Brahe, a stargazer in Frangistan. By coincidence, at the time the apprentices were laying the foundation stone of their observatory, Brahe was being erected in far-off Uraniborg. The two men, instead of locking horns with each other, had been exchanging letters of mutual esteem and admiration. We love the same woman, Taqiyuddin said. What do you mean? Jahan faltered. The sky, we are both besotted with her. Sadly, we are mortal. After we are gone, others will love her. Once the celestial instruments had been placed in their respective spots, on heavy cast iron stands, Taqiyuddin showed Sinan's apprentices around. Everywhere he turned, Jahan saw astronomical clocks with 3 dials, exquisitely crafted and precise. In a chamber towards the back they noticed water pumps of different sizes, which Taqiyuddin said had nothing to do with the azure but were simply another passion of his. Upstairs there was a massive astrolabe with 6 rings, Dat al-Halak. This was used to assess the latitudes and longitudes, so they were told. Another device, Libna, mounted on the wall, consisted of 2 large brass quadrants and helped to calculate the declinations of the stars and the sun. Lengthy pieces of wood, which by their humble appearance seemed meaningless, turned out to measure the parallax of the moon. An implement with a copper ring assessed the azimuths of the stars, the one next to that determined the equinoxes. Jahan's favorite was a sextant that measured the distances between the celestial bodies. In each room they entered they found a device that unraveled yet another secret of the blue firmament. The court astronomer explained that with heavenly bodies, as with so many things in life, one had to find the right guide. Rather than taking the moon as his reference point, he studied 2 wandering stars. One was called Venus, the other Aldebaran, a name Jahan liked so much he kept repeating it to himself, as though it were poetry. Unlike the instruments, which were new, the books and manuscripts in the library were ages old. It was here that Taqiyuddin kept his treatises on geometry, algebra and the forces of motion. He was particularly pleased that in a recent decree, addressed to the Qadis of Istanbul, the Sultan had ordered the people who possessed valuable collections to hand these over to the Royal Observatory. When you receive this order, find those books based on astronomy and geometry, and give them to my honorable astronomer, Taqiyuddin, so that he may continue his excellent work, under my protection. With an endorsement so strong they thought nothing could go wrong. Immaculate inside, immaculate outside, the observatory, their observatory, with its windows iridescent in the evening sun, shone atop a hill in Tophane. The opening ceremony was glorious. Above their heads the sun hovered bright and generous, the sky a seamless blue. Regardless, the air felt crisp and chilly, as though both the winter and the summer had wanted to be present on such a day. Seagulls swooped far ahead, not shrieking for once, swallows dipped and drank water from the marble fountain in the courtyard. The smell of myrrh on their robes and beards mingled with the sweet fragrance of the halva Taqiyuddin had ordered to be doled out to the workers, who had toiled hard to finish on time. Sinan was present, clad in a cinnamon kaftan and a bulbous turban, the fingers of his right hand moving around an imaginary rosary. The apprentices stood some steps behind him, trying hard to conceal their pride. For, although it was Sultan Murad's health and triumph and the chief royal astronomer's success that they were here to pray for, the students of Sinan had contributed much to this observatory. They could not help but be pleased with the 2 buildings they had designed, constructed, and made ready for use, under the auspices of the master but still theirs alone. This was their creation, may the Creator forgive the word, which belonged only to him. Beyond the observatory grounds was an expanse of onlookers and well-wishers, their voices carrying in the wind. Foreign envoys observing the happenings, merchants calculating what this could bring to them, pilgrims murmuring prayers, beggars seeking alms, thieves searching for prey, and children perching on their fathers' shoulders to get a glimpse of the place where you could watch the sun and the moon, and even learn where the shooting stars went when they tumbled down. Taqiyuddin, tall and erect, stood at the center, wearing a flowing garb white as alabaster. 40 sheep and 40 cows had been sacrificed early on, their meat distributed to the poorest of the poor. Now a drop of their blood shone on his forehead, between his eyes. To his left and to his right 24 astronomers had lined up, their faces shining with delight. Abruptly, All sound subsided. A ripple of excitement went through the audience. Sultan Murad was coming. Like water, his presence flowed into the courtyard, filling each empty space, long before his cavalcade was spotted in the distance. The shadow of God on earth was going to open the biggest observatory in the 7 climes. Once the Sultan and his guards had arrived and settled, a Sufi sheikh began to pray, his voice at once loud and mellow. May Allah afford his protection to our magnanimous Sultan. They echoed in unison, savoring the word as if it were a tasty morsel. Amen. May Allah have mercy on our glorious empire and guide us in all our deeds. And help us to join those who have been through this world before and have not erred. May Allah look after this house and reveal the secrets of the heavens to those and only those who can bear them. Amen. As Jahan listened to the Sufi's words, his gaze strayed towards the ulama, the religious seniors, who were watching the ceremony. There had been rumors that the Shaykh al-Islam, when asked to lead the communal prayer, had refused. Jahan observed the man's face. He looked composed, his expression tranquil as a pond. Just then he pursed his lips, his mouth twisting into a scowl, as if he had tasted something bitter. Jahan didn't think anyone had noticed, enraptured, as they were, by prayer. But he had seen it, that tiny gesture, and his chest tightened. For a moment that was as brief as the ascent of a soaring condor, Jahan knew in his gut, even though there was nothing obviously out of the way, that something was wrong. He had the intense feeling that Sinan was also aware of this, hence the nervous motion of his fingers. In the meantime Taqiyuddin, in his exhilaration, had not suspected a thing. Later on Jahan would contemplate this moment at length. Sinan had not had much experience with the ulama, but he could nonetheless sense their profound dislike. Taqiyuddin, on the other hand, knew them far better than anyone. After all, he had served as a judge, a theologian, a muwakkit, the keeper of time, and a teacher at a madrasa. Yet he did not share the unease that the master and the apprentice had felt that day. Perhaps, Jahan would conclude, with closeness came blindness, and with a certain distance, awareness. Taqiyuddin was writing a treatise on heavenly beings, a book he called Azij. Therein he registered the positions and distances and motions of the sun and the moon and the stars and the celestial bodies. This would take him years, he explained, but when finished it would be a guide in perpetuity. Azij is a map, he explained. A map of the divine creation. Long ago an infidel sage by the name of Aristo, a man who had taught the great Iskander everything he knew, held that the earth was at the center of the universe and that it was peacefully at rest, unlike other celestial bodies. He left it to astronomers to find the sum of the spheres that rotated around it, the cumulative number of the many domes that moved above their heads. Have you been able to count them? Jahan asked when, following the inauguration, he and Davud paid him a visit. 8, Taqiyuddin said decidedly. It was an impeccable number, and for a good reason: the shape of the earth, the arrangement of the heavenly bodies, the layers of the universe, everything was put in order by God for human beings to see, study and contemplate. The more Taqiyuddin talked, the more garrulous he became. He said as brilliant as Aristo had been, he had got things wrong. It was the sun that was at the heart of the universe, not the earth. The other bodies revolved round this ball of fire in perfect circles. He showed Jahan a book that, he said, proved this beyond doubt. Jahan read aloud its title, the words in Latin gliding on his tongue, smooth and round, something to do with the revolution of spheres. Copernic. What a strange name, he thought, yet the chief royal astronomer had pronounced it with such veneration that from his mouth it sounded like an incantation. He had a sweetheart but never married, said Taqiyuddin, pointing at the leather-bound tome as if it were alive. He raised his sister's children and had none of his own. Davud asked, why didn't he become espoused? God knows. But probably for the woman's sake. What wife can bear a husband who sees only the skies? Davud and Jahan eyed each other, thinking the same thing. Although Taqiyuddin was married, he slept in the observatory most nights. They did not dare to ask if, when talking about Copernic, he had been alluding to himself as well. Thanking the architect and his acolytes, Davud and Jahan bade them farewell. Scarcely had they stepped outside when they were engulfed by a wave of fog, penetrating and sinister. Fumbling like two blind men, they found Chota, climbed up to their places and slowly, very slowly, trotted towards the city. A few steps into this walk Jahan felt an urge to turn back and look. Something strange happened then. Of the two tall buildings that formed the observatory, not a single thing could be seen, not even a flickering candle from the windows or a glow from the instruments on the upper terrace. So fully had its contours sunk into the sea of grey that in that moment it felt like the observatory had never existed and that everything said and done under its roof had been nothing more than prints in the sand.